Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly. It's Rick from Blind, and I think we're going to have a pretty exciting episode. A lot of our listeners will be likely familiar with Karat, probably some firsthand experience. Jeffrey Spector is on our show today. He's the co-founder and president of Karat, and Karat helps companies conduct technical job interviews and improve their hiring processes. The startup was last publicly valued at $1.1 billion, so it's a great unicorn. Prior to Karat, Jeffrey worked as the chief of staff at the Gates Foundation. In this role, he worked side by side with Melinda Gates to optimize the foundation's strategies, with a particular focus on job candidate experiences and researching how post-secondary education can better translate into economic opportunity. Thanks for coming on the show, Jeffrey.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I want to start with your experience as Melinda Gates' chief of staff. I might be the obvious first question, but I want to avoid burying the lead there. The chief of staff role is becoming more popular in the tech industry, but people might be more familiar with it in the context of politics. How would you describe your role as chief of staff and how you got started there?
Yeah, I felt really fortunate to have that job. It was an amazing opportunity for me. And working very closely with Melinda was incredible. My role was very wide ranging there. I was actually her first chief of staff. She had her kids were getting older, and she wanted to invest more time into the foundation, and so she really wanted to figure out like how was she gonna ramp up her involvement in the foundation. And so I was helping her think through that. But it ranged from a lot of different things, but I'd say the majority of what I was doing was just being a strategic thought partner to her. The foundation has something like 27 different strategies, from malaria to tuberculosis to agricultural development. They're doing incredible work across a wide variety of areas. And so, it would be helping her think through those, process all the strategies from those organizations, and really just being someone who she could kind of bounce ideas off of and think through like what is the best approach that we could take as an organization. I'd say the second thing was really like helping her prioritize her time and her focus areas. So she started to go really deep on supporting women and girls around the world, which has now led to Pivotal Ventures, her organization today, plus what the work they're doing at the Gates Foundation. So it was kind of like, what is it that you really are passionate about, and where do you want to, spend most of your time improving? And then I'd say that the third thing was really being like a liaison between her and the organization, and also her and like external partners. And part of that was ensuring that I was a truth teller, and that she was hearing the reality. Like, we were defining her learning agenda, but also I think when you run an organization that large, it's sometimes hard to get real feedback about what's going on, both your organization, but also like the strategy you're having. And so I was trying to always facilitate like honest, genuine dialogue between her and our either employees or partners as well.
That's an interesting part that you mentioned, because isn't that a challenge with a lot of organizations where the information is filtered before it goes to the CEO or the C-suite, because they want to either protect them, they want to do damage control. So then sometimes the senior people don't know what's really going on because no one's giving that information. So I didn't think of it that way, but for what you do, that's a really important role, right?
Yeah, and I think leaders do have to figure out how to create opportunities to hear directly. Either it's still talking to customers, like if you're at a company, it's like, how do I actually, even if you've scaled, I mean, we're doing hundreds of thousands of interviews, but like, I still try and talk to candidates, right, on a one-to-one basis, because the numbers. Bill Gates Sr. used to always say something. He used to say, this is Bill Gates' dad would say, that these numbers are our neighbors, right? And what he meant by that is like they're real people associated. So as you get bigger and bigger, and you're looking at, we're doing X thousands of interviews, it's still like every one of those people really care about obviously their career and their trajectory, and you can't ever forget that as you scale. And so hearing from people directly is really, really important. So you have to create like structures and mechanisms. And the same thing within your own company. You need to make sure this is why people have like skip level conversations or other things, just to make sure they're not just getting a filtered representation. And actually, when I was at the foundation, when I started as a chief of staff, I just started reaching out to like anyone at the organization, asking them, questions about strategies and things, and then kind of got a little bit of slap on the wrist from some of the senior leaders there of like, hey, you can't just go to like an analyst on my team and ask them, like they don't know the broader context. And so you do have to be, it wasn't politics necessarily, but it was more just understanding like who needs to be involved in conversations and decisions, and making sure it's representative.
I mean, it sounds like very obvious that like you're good at the job. It's an exciting, high impact, very visible role. I mean, what kind of made you give that up and decide to get started in tech, get that entrepreneurial spirit, and start Carrot?
Well, if you actually back up in my career, so let me just give you a little bit on like how my
Please.
career journey happened, because I think that'll be revealing a little bit. I actually started like when I was in college. I did an internship at an investment bank, and realized, wow, that's just like not the culture that I want to be involved in. I was like,
Sure.
it was great. I learned a ton, but the bank I was at just didn't resonate with me. I had actually studied abroad in China, and so I went back after school, kind of right when China was really emerging as a superpower, and I got a job at a tech startup out there. So my first job was at a tech startup. I was employee 5 at a company that was doing right at the advent of text messaging. So I'm kind of dating myself here, but we were doing really like text messaging gaming, and so that it grew like crazy. I was employee 5. It grew to a couple hundred. It went public on the Nasdaq, but again, didn't really resonate. Like making mobile pets and horoscopes wasn't like the thing that motivated me in my life, I guess. Um, and as part of that, and also there were things I still wanted to learn, right? And so I was in charge of like fundraising, helping fundraise as we raised capital along the way. But I just didn't understand how investors thought about the world. So I actually came back and joined a hedge fund here in the United States for a couple of years doing merger arbitrage. And while I was there, I read a book called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. It was like there was a New York Times article about it, and I was like, oh, this is intriguing. And it was all about how companies can do well while doing good. And it totally lit a fire in me. And it was kind of my Jerry Maguire moment of like, oh my God, wait, like who else, who's doing things in this area? Um, and so that led me to two things. One was the Gates Foundation, because they were really trying to figure out like how do I get the private sector to focus on causes that matter, right? And
Right.
take the power of the private sector to do that. Um, so that was kind of like why I was there. And then I also led me to microfinance, which was the team I joined when I started the foundation was called Financial Services for the Poor, which was really about like how do we democratize access to financial services? Because actually the fewer resources you have, the more you need high quality financial services to manage your resources. Um, and so I was at the foundation, and the job was incredible, and I learned a ton. But the strategies you put into place take many years to, you're actually funding other organizations to go do the work, to go build the thing. And then 5 years later, maybe if it worked or not, right? I mean, there's some that can come back faster, but I just had this itch still to build, right? And keep building something from scratch and having kind of maybe a feedback loop that was a little bit faster. And so Carrot is kind of this great combination of all those experiences where we're a very mission driven, purpose driven organization that we think there's a huge market opportunity, but at the same time, as we scale, we feel like our impact scales as well. I mean, tech is the greatest wealth creation engine of our time, and it needs to be built by all of us for all of us. And so it just felt like there was this incredible opportunity to both build a huge and successful business, but also one that was really meaningful.
No, I appreciate that context. It's very helpful because I mean, I think the gut reaction is, why focus on interviews, right? Why focus on tech? But when you have that context of, I mean, a lot of these interview processes just seem like a gatekeeping, right? They're inaccessible for many people. They're oftentimes different from kind of a traditional job interview. I don't know about you, Jack, but I had to learn how to interview in high school, and when I went to like my first job, some of it stuck, some of it worked, but oftentimes it was just completely, starting fresh. So I'd love to like figure out like how you got into like attacking that, and what you think that kind of differentiation is there for Carrot.
Well, how I got into it it was so at the foundation, they had kind of just been investing in their post-secondary education group in the United States, and I got really passionate about what they were doing. It was basically, they were trying to figure out like how do more people get degrees, right? Degree completion in community colleges and associate degrees and stuff. And I was really fixated on, well, do those degrees translate into the jobs that they actually are studying for? Because there's kind of multiple problems on that chain of like, a lot of people are getting debt, they're not getting the degree, or if they get the degree, they don't get the job they want. And I think, and I was sitting there literally like with community colleges, how do they define curriculum, right? And it's like a multi-year process. A lot of times they're inviting on like CEOs of companies who actually aren't at the level of like, I'm hiring for that role. They're maybe in the industry but they're on the committee. And so it's kind of a broken process of how you do that. And I think there was this aha that the interview is this moment that's so powerful, and there's so much information in the interview that never gets shared back with schools, and it never gets shared back with candidates to make them better, right? You don't really have any understanding of where you stand vis-a-vis a job. You don't get it. And so I was kind of thinking about like, how do we make that more seamless? My co-founder Mo was at Microsoft, and he was in charge of a strategy at Xbox, and they were hiring up like hundreds of software engineers in a very short amount of time. And the observations there were like, hey, it is very time consuming for our engineers. They don't want to be doing this. It's biased against certain people. It doesn't get better with data. The candidate experience is pretty awful. And we were kind of like, oh, like there's just the same problem of how do we improve this interview, which is also, by the way, super critical to companies, right? The hiring is the most important decision they're going to make. It's like who to hire. And so we had this realization that, interviewing is this thing that is done in a secondary manner. Like nobody has it as really their primary responsibility. You don't get hired because you're a good interviewer. You get hired because you're a good engineer. And then there's this, okay, I'll also make you interview. And we felt like it should be treated like the sacred craft that it is, right? And so we felt like interviewing should be a job. And that's what we've done at Karat, which is we've made interviewing a job, and we interview on behalf of other companies at scale consistently, like American Express or Indeed or Roblox. And we kind of do thousands of interviews on their behalf, and we're kind of the ones that say, hey, these are the people that are most likely to move on. But that interview is just such a powerful moment in the trajectory of a company and also the lives of a candidate that we felt like it deserved the respect, more respect and more attention.
So Jeff, what kind of process do you have for the interview? Is it a combination of tech driven to find out their skills and communication skills, or just one?
So mostly our interviews focus on the tech side of things, because that is probably the biggest like filter, I would say, for companies. Like most people are at the front end of the stage, right? Because it's a process that you're trying to be like, how do I most effectively optimize our time as a company to hire the right people? And so we focus on the technical skills, which is like the thing that they usually start with. But definitely, we will assess communication skills in the interview. We're not testing directly for it, but if somebody is like they don't understand the questions, or they're rude to the interviewer, right? We'll flag that to our companies of like, hey, this person said something you might want to like check out. It was inappropriate in the interview. It may, kind of violate some of your cultural values. But for the most part, we are really focused on their like, it's a competency based interview, right? We're trying, a lot of what we try and do is, and I think you kind of hinted at like fairness in this, but a lot of where I think the industry has evolved to is evolving to is like, how do I make interviews as competency based as possible? Like, what are the various traits that are going to make someone successful on the job? And that is really what we focus on.
Do you do it in person? Do you do it via video? And also, do they try to like do coding in real time and then get judged on how well they perform?
Yeah, so it is it takes a lot of different flavors depending on what we're interviewing for. But yes, there is a live human, we call an interview engineer on our end. And by the way, on the interview engineers, like the number one thing that candidates comment on is the quality of the interviewer, right? Like it kind of makes sense that, like, I think the industry has been mostly selecting engineers to interview based on like, do they have time available, as opposed to are they really good at interviewing? And so it kind of reminds me of, at the Gates Foundation, actually, we spent a decent amount of resources figuring out that teachers were like the most important thing to to student success, which looking back seems very obvious, but we wanted to prove it, right? It's the same thing. It's like who's in that room and how they're interacting with you, super important, right? And so yeah, so ours are a live interview where the core of it tends to be coding, where you're doing coding back and forth. But a lot of it is, this is the benefit of having that human being in there, is that interaction between the two of you, where if you're heading in the wrong direction, they can help guide you back or ask questions about it. You can reveal your thinking. So even if you run out of time, you can still actually demonstrate that you know where you're going. You don't actually have to complete it within the window of time. And in fact, we see that like about a third of the people who end up getting hired at our clients didn't finish their solution within the time in the interview, because at the end of it, the interviewer will say, okay, well, where were you headed with this? And then they'll kind of say, this is where I was going. Here's what I was, what I've done. And so it's kind of more of a, an analytical discussion that they're doing in that interview. But they are doing, it's usually like 60 minutes. They're doing a coding portion. There may be other things like systems design that we might talk through in that interview as well. Whatever the kind of competencies are for the role will match with what the interview is.
I love this concept of an interview engineer, right? Because you're exactly right. Like people often say, like, I have to do my like 2 interviews a week or something, right? Or I have to get this like check off my, job responsibility for my performance review that I did it. And when you have people that are just kind of going through the motion, you almost create these like inequities, right? Where there's either inconsistencies in terms of how candidates are being evaluated, or because they don't really want to be there, they might introduce biases like, oh, you went to Berkeley, I went to Berkeley,
Totally.
I'm familiar with the science, and you create this like access gap. Um, I mean, are you seeing in terms of your client base, or in terms of a kind of just tech recruiting at large, that like concepts like this just help make things more objective, or like more like fact based, or more kind of equal in terms of access and inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you're exactly right. Like generally interviews are not that fair, right? Like, I mean, I think this is part of the problem. Like if you look, our mission is to make interviews fair, predictive, and enjoyable. And we think there's like dramatic room for improvement on all three of them compared to the status quo, right? All three of those
Sure.
words. I mean, even just take like who gets an interview, right, is biased, right? Like if you are biased, and not necessarily like with ill will, right, at why they interview certain people, but it's like, hey, if I feel like they went to a top school, or they worked at a certain company, maybe there's a higher likelihood they might do better. And so what ends up happening is people that come from non-traditional backgrounds will get left out of that interviewing process, right? So one is just like who's actually getting a shot is probably biased against certain populations. You're exactly right. Like who the interviewers a lot of times are biased towards people that look like them or act like them. And so, if it's not competency based, like if you don't have a rubric that actually defines what is it that you're trying to assess for, and you have really clearly laid out like what does good look like versus not, and can you demonstrate what they did or said that actually align to when you give them a bad review or a good review, right? That can be really biased as well. Like hand holding is another, or like hinting is a huge form of bias in interviews, which we've had to kind of work really hard to eliminate, which is, if I tell you basically the solution, you're going to do really well. But if I
Sure.
just sit there and don't say anything, you may not do really well. And two equally qualified candidates could have very different outcomes coming out of that. So I think like there's a lot of different things within the interview, and that's kind of why actually like a lot of the way we've built Karat has tried to combat that. So for example, like our interviewers or our interview engineers don't look at resumes before they head into an interview, right? If you're just assessing for technical skills, you don't need to know where they worked or what school they went to go to. You're not digging like into their background or their resume. So even why am I even raising that potential source of bias in their heads, right?
Right.
We call kind of this thing of you got to move away from the personal into the structural when you want to eliminate bias. So structurally, just get rid of like the opportunity to do that. They aren't actually like a lot of what they're doing is just scoring what happened to. I said like they have really specific rubrics as to how they're going to score. We also look at like all the data afterwards, right? And we will go back and say, did any of these questions bias against certain populations? Did any of the interviewer bias against certain populations? why or what happened here, and how do we just make the whole system work more effectively as a result.
I mean, I'm also curious, like, have technical job interviews kind of evolved over time? You know, like it seems like in this more like kind of recent era when companies were really trying to hire like mad, they just had such large volumes that they were kind of using these like whiteboard problems, and they were like from like a test bank, because we see on Blind like many users kind of cram these like coding concepts online, or like they race to solve like a certain number of problems or coding challenges. I mean, it seems like a recent phenomenon, but perhaps like has this always been the case?
Well, if you just back up and like think about interviews in general, forget about technical interviews for a second.
Sure.
Um, like interviews are relatively recent development. I mean, it depends on your perspective, but like early 1900s or whenever Thomas Edison was like I don't know, actually he was alive. I should know this, but back in the day, like, it used to be apprenticeships, and like what your
Right.
family did, that's what you did, right? That you just knew, and everybody kind of groomed there. And Thomas Edison kind of had the first like interview where he was asking mostly trivia questions. He wanted to see like if you were smart and you knew like trivia, random facts. But what it did is actually started to democratize like who could get hired working with him. It wasn't like his son or something that you could go join his like factory of invention, right? That he had.
Right.
But since then, like most companies have had the power, right? Like it has been this like, I'm going to put you through your paces to get a job. And I think only recently has that power really started to shift, especially in software engineering, where like candidates are now, in more control of the process. And obviously recently with a lot of the layoffs, maybe it's starting to swing a little bit back towards the other way. But for the last like several
Right.
years, what it has forced is companies to have a lot of innovation in their hiring process. How do we make it more candidate friendly? Now you're talking, there were companies that have refined their processes to cut out all the unnecessary interviews, to make same day offers, right?
Wow.
Like improving, to be transparent about every step of the process and like where you are in it, right? There's been evolution of the actual like overall interview process. From a technical interview point of view, I mean, it's definitely moved away. If you think about, 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot of brain teasers, right? And it was like, how do you move a mountain, or like, how do you get around thing in the, whatever, all those
Right.
questions.
Right. How many windows in New York City?
Yeah. These
Right,
these
Why a
Google
exactly.
manhole
questions,
cover
right?
is round. Yeah,
Right,
that kind of
exactly.
stuff. Yeah.
And I think there's been a movement away from that. There's been a recognition that those are not actually relevant to the job, right? Just because you can understand that. And they were trying to probably do it by proxy, like, are you smart, right? But that's very hard to get at. And it also like there's lots of sort of bias when you're just doing like cognitive assessments. And so they moved more towards like a competency-based approach. And even more so, like if you think about even 5-10 years ago, it was a lot more whiteboarding. Now there's like shared programming on your computer in your environment. It's getting closer and closer towards mimicking real life, right? That being said, interviewing is still somewhat artificial, right? Like I'm not going to say it's not, right? Like the best form of interviewing would be contract to hire. I'm going to work with you for 6 months or a year, see how you do, and then I'm going to hire you. But not everybody has a year to work with somebody to figure out whether or not they're good, and they can't make that decision. So, I think that's like, even for Karat, we've done a lot, and we've tried to move to a world where you don't have to cram for interviews. But if you're good as an engineer, right? Like if you're cramming for an interview, it means you're getting better as an engineer, right? That's what should happen, right? Like you shouldn't have to cram for an interview, but if you are doing that, it just means like your fundamental skills are improving while you do that, and you're actually getting better. And so that's the hope.
Jeff, you brought up something that's interesting. I've noticed happening recently. You talked about instead of hiring full time, you hire somebody as a contract person. And this is not just for tech, this is across the board. And I'm noticing for young people, particularly, they'll get contracts instead of full employment. But then when things go bad, they're the first ones to go. So it seems kind of cruel that, they don't have access to getting that full-time permanent role, to get their foot in the door, to learn about the corporate culture, to get immersed in it. And you have that contract. And then unfortunately, given the time period with layoffs and hiring freezes, they're the first ones to go out, which is kind of a bummer that you're doing. Because I do think that you're onto something where having that, ability to kind of learn on the job as you're going along, and they say, wow, Rick is great, Jeff is great, let's put him on full time, or have an apprenticeship where you kind of learn and grow, and then you say, yes, this person is perfect. But I don't see that too much. But I'm just
Yeah.
curious also, Jeff, can you do this? Do you think the same thing would hold for non-tech jobs, where people could not share their resume, come in and just be judged or by the merit of what they know? Or is it tech is just like, it's so like cut and dry that you could do it and you can't do it, and others, it's not the same.
We talk a lot about, is our model applicable, and we definitely get demand all the time to go into like sales and other other trades. I think the easiest thing to port over would be anywhere where there's like an objective truth, right?
Mhm.
Like I think the benefit of software engineering is I know when a solution is more optimal than not, like runtime's faster. There are ways in
Right.
which you can prove that.
Right.
If I was assessing an artist, right, and you were assessing an artist, you and I could have
It's
very
yeah.
different opinions as to what, you like Picasso, I like Rembrandt, right? Like it could be very different as to what good looks like. And so I think it may be harder to do something like this where you're kind of more artistic, but I think anything where you have an objective assessment, like the concept underlying Karat, right? Of, hey, we need to make this more competency based, more structured, more objective, more transparent, right? One thing we haven't talked about is there's a huge source of bias because people don't have the networks into tech, and therefore they don't understand like what an interview is going to look like. And so then the person who has a cousin at Google will get the job as somebody who doesn't have that. Like,
Mm.
all those things that are underlying it. So how do we make something more transparent to everybody? Like those things are all universally applicable, right? If the whether or not like Karat could do it well would depend, I think, a little bit on like uh whether or not there's an objective truth.
Do you offer like an intro to people who fit that bill, where you say, hey, they really don't, they'll go for an interview and they may think it's going to be like an old school interview or like a non-tech interview, in the sense, tell me about yourself. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And all of a sudden they have to code and be like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. Is there something like right up front you could share with people, or you do share with people and say, hey, this is the kind of interview, so they know coming in what to do beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things there I would comment on. So one, definitely like candidate preparation is
Hmm.
super critical, right? Like nobody should have an advantage because they know someone at your company over someone else that's interviewing, right? That is inherently unfair. And so the more you can do to prep someone, it's actually easier to do also than giving feedback to every candidate, right? Afterwards is just setting expectations about what does success look like ahead of time, right? So you kind of get the benefit of, you're almost giving feedback before they go in there, and also you get a truer performance out of the person because maybe they didn't know what you, not only is it like, what are you going to do, but what do you value, right? Like, do you value completion or optimality, right? Like speed of completion. Like you can do different trade-offs as a candidate to do those two things if you knew what they were evaluating you on, right? And so if you don't say it out loud, like the candidate, you could also just miss out on a great candidate. So the first thing I'd say is like, you definitely want to make sure that you are as transparent as possible about what you're interviewing for. The second thing is like, there are mechanisms you can put in to help with that. So for example, Karat, about a year after we started, we added in something we call the redo interview, which is every candidate can request to take their interview over again if they feel like it wasn't representative of their skills. And we'll assign you a different interviewer and a different question. And what we found is that it is hugely beneficial to underrepresented folks in tech because they take it at they're at disproportionately higher rates, and they do better on it, right? Because they're less familiar with the process. And so you end up getting people that do better the second time than the first time. We just now crossed the 1,000 hire mark for the redo. The cool thing about it also is it's equally as efficient in terms of the cost as going out and finding more candidates, right? Like you have to interview the same number of people on the redo as you do as like top of your funnel to get to another hire. So you're basically getting more hire. You're having less false negatives, right? And it's
Interesting.
just a way better candidate experience because even knowing I have an ability to do a redo, like de-stresses the first interview. So a lot of people that don't take the redo do better and more accurately in their first interview otherwise. So you can do things like the redo. And we advocate for every company to do the redo. It's not just a Karat thing. Like it actually makes just good financial and and social sense to do the redo. And then the third thing is we've done things like we created a program called Brilliant Black Minds, which is like more a larger effort to disrupt some of what you're talking about and level the playing field against some systemic biases that exist.
Because I can see another bias too, because I'm sure you're aware of it. There are entities out there that prep people for these kind of interviews. So that's another kind of bias in which if you have the means, the money, the connections to kind of have that prep, so when they go for an interview like this, they're kind of really pretty good to go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we see that yet at like at a huge level of like a huge industry around interview prep, like funding, but clearly there are people out there like cramming and practicing, and I think the bigger issue is just like access to the information about what an interview is and the ability to like, where do I go to practice, right? And the people that have access to that versus don't. But I agree. I mean, it is inherent. This is why we created Brilliant Black Minds, and so Brilliant Black Minds. I don't know if you're interested in this, but is a program that that we created that if you back up in Karat's history, like when we first started, we wanted to make sure we were building a very fair solution. And so we ended up doing kind of a roadshow for about 6 months in the early years, my co-founder and I, and a woman named Portia Kibble-Smith, who's our head of diversity partnerships. We toured the country meeting with underrepresented talent to understand like what are their experiences like, and how do we build a more inclusive interviewing solution. And I'll never forget, we went to Howard University and we met with a couple students there, and one of them said, 80% of Silicon Valley hires people who they know, and we're not the people who they know, right? And so it really lit a fire in our bellies. They're like, hey, how do we actually address that? So that's all the stuff I was talking about before. We started doing down the research of like, how do we build a fair solution, structured interviews, transparency, all that stuff kind of came out of the research. But we also recognized that even if we built like an interview that was completely not biased, there's still systemic issues that people are facing even getting to the interview, right? And even getting access to that interview. And you can see it in our data, like after about 200,000 interviews, only 5% of the engineers coming through are Black. It's the least represented population in tech. And so when we dug into the barriers there, it was some of those things of like, I don't have networks into tech. I have fewer networks into tech. I mean, we could see it like in our data for any given level of Karat performance, people who referred into the company are twice as likely to get hired as others, right? But Black candidates are referred in 35% fewer times than their peers. So just not having those networks, you're not even going to get a shot on that, and you probably don't even know as much of what the interview process is like. And so we created Brilliant Black Minds, which is to address this. And and the other thing I would say actually is that people aren't getting that interview practice. One of the things we found out was that if you do 3 practice interviews, you're 6 times more likely to get a job, and you feel twice as confident in your ability to interview. And so we now have a program where Black engineers across the country have unlimited access to free practice interviews. They can get interviews, they get feedback in the interviews and after the interviews. We have a series of workshops for them that are like, what is a technical interview, but also like, what's a recruiting process? Can I negotiate my salary? Other things that they care about. We have a Discord community that they can join where they can support each other and ask questions. There's office hours. And then about 6 months ago, Serena Williams joined as our champion of brilliance. And she took the program from what it was, where we were really focused on HBCU students, to all Black engineers in the country. And then about a month ago, we actually announced something called Partners of Brilliance, where we have 5 of our clients have committed to supporting and hiring out of the Brilliant Black Minds community, because previous to that, candidates were kind of going through, but it was really pure practice. And then as they were getting better, they were kind of asking us like, hey, can you connect me to a job? And we were like, yeah, of course, our companies are hiring. They want to hire Black candidates. So that's kind of where we added on recently.
I mean, what have you been able to achieve to date through Brilliant Black Minds? Like, are you getting the feedback from your client base saying like, oh, wow, you've unlocked a new talent pool, like give me more? Or, like what else can we kind of like learn from your initiative?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really successful so far. I think the number one thing we're really proud of is that the feedback from the participants is really strong, right? I mean, to the point earlier that we're seeing, you know, there's a lot of, if you actually go on to like LinkedIn or Twitter or something, people will be citing Brilliant Black Minds, talking about, hey, I got this job at Microsoft, and thank you so much, Brilliant Black Minds. I feel like I was, you know, so well prepared to go into those interviews. Really appreciate it, right? And those ones, and then there's like a
I've seen that,
dopamine
by
hit.
the way, Jeff.
What?
I've seen that, by the way.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
But like, you know, we share that. We have a channel internally or our whole company. Whenever like there's a post like that, it gets shared and everybody kind of gets that dopamine hit. So the first thing is just, you know, are we helping the people in the program? We've had about 2,500 people sign up for it so far, which there's only 100,000 Black engineers in the country. So that is actually a pretty substantial percentage of that for where we, you know, like the evolution of where we are in the program. But yeah, we're definitely measuring it by, you know, how many people are actually feeling like they've benefited from this and then also gotten hired. And demand for Brilliant Black Minds is really, really high. I mean, I think most companies are recognizing they are not succeeding in moving the needle on their underrepresented hires to the degree that they want. And so you know, when they heard about this, they've definitely come to us to say, can you help us with that? And there's a lot of other ways in which we help our clients improve. There's Brilliant Black Minds plus our core offering. We do a lot of work to help them hire more equitably as well.
Got it. I mean, that's a shocking stat that there are so few just Black engineers just out there. I mean, I'm sure you're like it's top of mind for you and you're working on it, but like how else can we like encourage there to be more like people to consider, right? Just like the
Well,
engineering or technology profession.
yeah, I mean, our goal, by the way, of the Brilliant Black Minds program is to double the number of Black engineers in tech within the next decade. So we are
Oh, brilliant.
thinking like holistically about how to do this. And so it's a
Right.
great question. I mean, DEI is an interesting thing, right? It is one of these things where there's no silver bullet and you have to do 1,000 things correctly, you know, and you have to work on all of them. Now that is very daunting, but it's also really encouraging because it means you could literally get started tomorrow and make a difference, right? And you know, we've run into it with some of our clients that, for example, we pre-qualify talent by going through a Karat interview, and they'll still end up not getting an interview on site because they didn't go to the right school, they didn't work at the right places, they're unwilling to relocate, right? Like just as examples of ways in which companies can look at all their internal practices and be like, hey, for the people who are trying to break in, like, am I making it as seamless as possible? And then am I supporting them once they get started? Like, do I have programs to make, you know, do I have mentorship programs once they come in that they're going to feel at home? You know, do I have tracks that will provide additional supports to encourage like promotion and development? Am I looking at all my like promotion and pay equity to make sure that, you know, those things are not biased as well? So there's a lot, you know, and obviously we have to go back earlier as well, right? Because people are dropping out of the funnel early. Like, you know, there's no access to computer science classes in a lot of high schools or middle schools in this country, and it's probably very
Right.
correlated to like the wealth in those areas, right? Maryland, randomly, is the like one of the best states in the country for producing like Black female engineers because they require computer science courses in high school. You have to like, I think 97% or 99% of high schools in Maryland have computer science courses, and
Wow.
everybody's required to do one like a scientific or sorry, a tech enabled course you have to graduate from in order to graduate. So it's just exposing people earlier on has a huge difference in outcomes there. So there's, you know, we do have to work on this across the funnel, but companies themselves can definitely do a lot to help with this problem.
I mean, I like that concept, right? Because I think within the tech industry, a big issue that doesn't get discussed often is, you know, we see it a lot. There's this kind of like gatekeeping of like who exactly belongs or deserves to be working, like call themselves a techie, or who deserves to be in tech, right? We see like there's these day in the life videos that go viral on TikTok, and the underlying kind of sensation there is, oh, these folks, you know, they're almost like beneath me, and they don't belong in the same kind of cohort as I am. like I don't know where this like us versus them kind of gatekeeping kind of mentality comes from. Do you have a maybe an idea of how we can combat that?
I think it's probably one of these things where as representation continues to grow, those things will hopefully be diluted more. Like if we actually do all the things to get people in and support them, like as you just change the composition of the team itself, like in when it's no longer like you're the only one, now it's actually like no, you can eliminate questions of like, are they only here because of X, right? By having a lot of people that look like that in the company, right? Now it's no longer that. Now it's like, no, I'm going to hire for, it's like there is no question. And by the way,
Right.
that question tends to be like it's one where I don't think it's deserved, right? And people are there because they're qualified, but I think people in the back of
Yeah.
their heads will oftentimes raise that up even though it's totally unjustified. And so I think just if you do the work and your company actually starts to look representative, then a lot of that goes away, right? Because now who is the de facto software engineer, right? So you're no longer thinking of the white male who wears a hoodie in Silicon Valley as your software engineer, right?
Sure.
If you blow that up, right? Like that means that everybody else will think of themselves and you're not questioning, hey, can I do this, can I not do this? Because who you see matters, right? Who you can actually see in the job and being successful. And so a lot of that looks like, do we have that's what I was getting back to, like promotion. Are those people in leadership roles? Are they progressing
Right.
or not? And is your company actively working to support that?
Jeff, is this just in the US or are you doing this in other countries as well?
So currently, Brilliant Black Minds is in the US only, but clearly, like there is a need for this. Like the Black population is maybe these issues may be the most pronounced for that population here in the US, but it's clearly not. They're not alone in facing some of the same obstacles, right? And so
Right.
the same, like, is there applicability of this programs spreading to, support female engineers or Latinx engineers? 100%, right? Like, and globally as well. Generally, like global diversity, when you talk to companies that are thinking about diversity globally, it's usually gender is more of what they're focused on than race. The United States is obviously a little bit more skewed towards like underrepresented talent than other countries are. But so if we were to do something internationally, I think what other companies would care more about would probably be the gender ratios.
Which is fascinating because I mean the early days of computer science, they were all fabulous female engineers, right? And suddenly we just have
Yeah,
this like recent stereotype of the guy in the hoodie is quite recent, right? It's like recent in the tune of the last 5 to 10 years.
yeah, you're
uh
totally right. There's a ton of unsung heroes.
yeah.
I forgot there's that movie like Hidden Figures or
Mhm.
that came out about NASA and stuff. It's like, yeah, there's so many untold stories. Well, it's also like who writes the history, right?
Sure.
Really matters too, and who controls the economy and things like that. Then it's anyway. There's a lot of work to do.
Jeff, are you putting together an offering where, and I think you kind of alluded to it, now you're in, right? You're working at XYZ tech company, but to help leadership determine who's getting promoted, are people overlooked, the same, similarly, the way you're kind of having that funnel to get people in, but then once they're in, do they hit roadblocks because no one's championing their cause or no one is paying attention? Like, okay, you're here and all right, that's it. As opposed to say, okay, how can they get to that next level, the next level and so forth?
Yeah, so we definitely have strategic conversations with our clients. Like, one of the things about Karat is that we feel like a lot of our work is building or helping them think strategically about their hiring and promotion systems and everything inside to make sure they're top quality. We don't have product or a solution really about that currently, so it's more of like, hey, these are the things you should think about or do. But like we do on our end, like let me just give you an anecdote of how we'd work with a client to kind of blow up something that is very hidden, right? Um, so uh, as people go through Karat, right, they kind of, for different companies, we may have different like categories of their performance, right, on Karat, how they did against those competencies. And what we were finding at one of our clients was that people who did really, really well in the interview, like men and women when they went on site, were getting offers or not offers, but they were getting invited on site at the same rates, right? So if you did really well, it was like 100%, 100%. If you did really poorly, it was like 0%, 0%, right? But if you were right on the bar, it was like 80% men get passed through, 40% women, right? And so then we can go to them and say, hey, we're looking at this data. Like, can you explain what's going on here? Like, who is involved in the decision-making process on your end at this critical juncture right here? You know, what is the criteria they're making about who gets passed through and who doesn't? Who's involved in that decision? And like, let's talk through that, right? And then within a quarter, it was at parity, right? But it's a very subtle, nuanced, you know, we're talking about a sub-segment of candidates coming through. And if you don't do structured interviews, you don't have the data, it's very hard to catch that, right? About what's going on. And so you kind of have to have that same level of like diligence about all of your processes in the company. And you need to have structure, even in your your promotion system. Why are people getting promoted? A promotion is kind of very similar to an interview in that, like, you know, you're assessing someone's performance over a certain period of time, right? So
Right.
the concepts I've talked about before should be applicable. So it's not just like, well, this manager didn't like the person underneath them, and that person doesn't get, you know, doesn't get promoted. And there's a whole bunch of bias that could be there too. So how do you actually create more structure and, you know, definition around what good looks like? And then they have to have proof one way or the other, instead of just, you know, I wrote this thing up and this person's not going to get promoted.
Got it. No, I think that's a good point that you make, right? Because a promotion packet, I think, promotion or the review cycles are just so like mm, they're hard topics to grok for a lot of people, right? They're very common points of discussion on blind, and I think your analogy to no, it's actually very similar to an interview process. You're being assessed for a role. It's the next role in the career path, or if you're deciding to transfer or whatever have you, it's the same kind of framing, right?
Yeah, and you know, a lot of times promotion packets or things will be like, here's what here's what they did this year, right?
Right.
Maybe they accomplished this thing or they didn't accomplish this thing, versus like, hey, in order to move to the next level, these are the competencies you have to demonstrate. Did they demonstrate those competencies or not? Right? Those are different things, right? And so you want to make, like, because for example, you could fail miserably at a project and still have done, you know, because the project itself was like a bad idea or whatever, right? And maybe it didn't even come from that employee, and
Right.
they were like executing, but the actual employee performed really well on that. And so then you're kind of teasing out, like, did they do what was asked of them? You know, and really, what's the next level, right? Like, what's the next level they're trying to get to, and where are they against that? And you should be constantly having that conversation with that employee of like, here's the gap, you know, to the next level, and this is what I need to do to improve to get there.
Got it. Why do you think the kind of promotion review cycle just tends to like have this like perennial problem? Like, what are companies doing wrong in terms of kind of whether that's like communicating the process or like setting expectations? Um, like
Yeah,
what's
and
at
I'm
play
no,
there?
just to be fair, I'm no expert in promotion and things. So this is
Sure,
just all
sure.
like kind of firsthand experience and stuff. But I think there's a huge recency bias. Like, people don't
Ah,
document things throughout. Like, a lot of this is like, how do you document as it's going along through the year? Like, you know, people only remember like what happened last week, and you're trying to assess someone for a
sure.
year. And so the more regular, you know, there's this movement to like more regular performance reviews. I think it's less like that. It's more of like, hey, when we have our one-on-ones, we're giving feedback, like, what were the good things? What were the things you need to work on? And then you should be able to go back to that, you know, and look at all of those and the totality of that, and actually have you know, a real dialogue. I think also, like, who's in the room when promotions are being made, right? Like, does everybody have equal transparency about how those, you know, like what good looks like? And then you know, there's historically there are marginalized communities are left out. They don't have anyone to advocate for them. So, you know, even if they have great performance, they're not getting a promotion, right? There's lots of different reasons why promotion systems probably are not as effective as they could be.
No, I would disagree with you a little bit on that point in terms of not being an expert. We really appreciate kind of your expert advice today. Like, I certainly learned a lot in terms of gosh, like what companies can do or have been doing in terms of the job application process, the interview process, and finally, like just access and democratization, right? And just getting rid of that gatekeeping mentality in tech that we see too often.
Yeah,
So thanks so much, Jeffrey.
no worries. And I just say,
Thanks,
like,
Jeff.
interviews are these things that can either be a barriered opportunity or a bridged opportunity, and everybody needs to work to make sure that they're a bridge.